Have you ever been laughed at by the very people who were supposed to protect you? Have you ever felt invisible in your own marriage, in your own family? This is the story of how one quiet woman turned that invisibility into her greatest strength and walked away without making a sound. If you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated, stay with me. And before we begin, make sure you subscribe to this channel because these stories remind us that silence isn't weakness. It's sometimes the loudest answer of all. I remember the moment so clearly that it still lives in my chest like a stone. The joke was meant to be harmless, just another line tossed into the air at a family gathering. But when the laughter spread across the table and reached the man I married, something in me shifted. It was as if a curtain had dropped, and behind it I finally saw where I stood. If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice, his sister said, with that practiced smile that always seemed to hide a sharper edge. The table erupted. Glasses clinked, and James, my husband, laughed too. Not just a polite chuckle, but the kind of laugh that shows agreement. I didn't laugh. I set my glass down slowly, as though the weight of it might steady me. My face didn't betray anything, at least I don't think it did. Years of learning how to smooth over moments had taught me how to keep still when my insides were shaking. But inside, something stopped asking for permission. Something stopped trying. On the drive home, the conversation was light, full of small details about the senator's handshake, the wine list, the fireworks still echoing in the distance. James drove with one hand on the wheel, the other scrolling his phone at red lights. I sat beside him, staring out at the blur of lights on the highway. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was quieter, heavier, like a door clicking shut in a house where you thought you'd lived freely. When he asked if I'd had a good time, I said it was fine. He nodded, distracted, and went back to telling me about his sister's new boyfriend. That was the moment I realized he hadn't even noticed my silence. At home, I excused myself early, claiming a headache. He accepted it without question, disappearing into his emails while I closed the bathroom door behind me. The mirror was too bright under the vanity light, and for a long time, I just looked at myself. Not the version I'd adjusted to fit in the softened voice, the straightened hair, the careful wardrobe, just me. My eyes looked tired. They looked honest. I whispered, "Maybe she's right." The words startled me because I had never said them aloud before. That maybe if I did disappear, if I stopped bending myself into their shapes, no one would notice. No one would ask where I'd gone. And if they did, it would only be for the inconvenience of it, not the loss. I thought about the years I had spent trying to belong in a family that never truly let me in. The way Diane, my mother-in-law, always found a way to remind me I wasn't one of them. The way Richard's nods felt like dismissal more than approval. The way Vanessa's gaze held calculation, not warmth. But more than that, I thought about James, the man who once told me he admired my authenticity, who promised he'd stand beside me. That night, I realized he had never really been looking. As I stood there in silence, the sound of him moving through the house felt distant, almost belonging to another life. I pressed my palms against the counter and forced myself to stay still. I knew what I was feeling wasn't fleeting. It wasn't hurt that would fade after sleep. It was something deeper, a recognition. The truth is, betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it's the sound of laughter at your expense, followed by silence where you hoped for defense. Sometimes it's the absence of someone reaching across the table to say, "That's not true." That night I crawled into bed beside him and turned my face toward the wall. He reached over once, brushing his hand across my shoulder, but it felt automatic, like muscle memory rather than care. I didn't move, I didn't speak. He fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady, while I lay awake staring at the outline of the curtains against the window. I kept hearing the words over and over. If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even notice. But what cut deeper wasn't her voice, it was his laugh. The man I loved, the man who vowed to choose me above all others, had laughed. And in that sound, I finally heard the truth of where I stood. By morning, nothing looked different. The kitchen smelled of coffee. He kissed my cheek in a hurry, mumbling about a meeting. The house looked the same, the routines intact. But inside, I knew something had ended. It wasn't the marriage, not yet. It wasn't even my loyalty to the family. It was the illusion. The illusion that I mattered to them in any way beyond convenience. The illusion that my place at the table was secure. The illusion that James truly saw me. I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Because deep down, I already understood. You don't argue with laughter. You don't fight to be seen by people who've already decided you are invisible. Instead, I carried the silence with me, not as weakness, but as the beginning of something else. Something quieter, but far stronger than anything they had ever imagined. That night at the mirror, I met myself without the filters I had spent years applying. For the first time in a long while, I didn't try to adjust the image staring back. I just held her gaze, and in that reflection, I found the faintest outline of someone I had almost forgotten, someone who didn't need their laughter to feel real. And that was the night the quiet began. I woke the next morning with the same quiet I fell asleep with, a silence that felt less like numbness and more like a choice I hadn't fully named yet. I moved through the house on instinct, making coffee, checking emails, preparing for work. Nothing looked different, yet I felt the distance, like I was watching myself play a role I no longer believed in. At the office, the pattern showed itself clearly once I decided to stop excusing it. I spoke ideas in meetings, measured and careful, and then waited for them to be repeated in louder voices. The credit always landed elsewhere. I used to tell myself results mattered more than recognition, but that morning I opened a notebook and began writing down dates, comments, and moments, not to prove anything to others, just to stop convincing myself it wasn't real. I wrote down the phrase I heard most often: let's not get ahead of ourselves. It came whenever I asked for a title, a role, or the authority my work had already earned. I noted how eyes drifted to James whenever a decision hovered, as though I were a guest sitting in someone else's chair. I underlined the word I had taught my mouth to use before anything risky: maybe. At home, the patterns were quieter, but no less sharp. When Diane suggested I straighten my hair for the next event, I did. When Richard called me Melissa again, I smiled. When Vanessa's plans disrupted mine, I rearranged. Each concession was small, but writing them down made them undeniable. On paper, the weight of so many small surrenders felt like standing outside myself, watching the edges blur. There were moments that gave me hope: clients thanking me privately, colleagues whispering, "You're doing more than they admit," Catherine's quiet encouragement at dinners. But those moments felt like candles in a long hallway. They warmed, but they didn't change the architecture. One afternoon, I asked for a formal title that matched my responsibilities. I had the numbers, the emails, the record. James listened, folded his hands, and said, "Let's revisit this next quarter." He smiled as if granting me a favor. "It's just not the right time." I nodded because I'd trained myself to nod. In the elevator afterward, I caught my reflection and thought, this is what disappearing feels like while standing up straight. The truth was painful. I had trained them to expect my silence. I had softened my voice until even I believed my words required permission. Realizing that wasn't shame, it was a map. You can't leave a place until you admit where you are. So I began small acts of resistance. I arrived 5 minutes early to meetings and wrote my points on the whiteboard before others sat down. When someone repeated me, I added, "Yes, that's what I proposed." When a project I led succeeded, I sent the summary myself and signed, "Team lead, me." I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. At home, I tested the same quiet strength. I wore my hair natural on a Sunday and realized the mirror felt less like a test. When Diane planned seating that placed me at the end of the table, I said calmly, "I'll sit next to James." She blinked, then shrugged, and nothing collapsed. Vanessa complained about scheduling, and I didn't adjust. The world kept turning. James noticed less than I expected. He was busy, proud of being busy. One night, brushing his teeth, he said, "We might be meeting the Japanese delegation." I asked who he meant. Without looking up, he answered, "Leadership." Then he paused, noticing my silence. "You good?" I rinsed my mouth, nodded. "I'm fine." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was closer than before. The ledger I kept filled quickly, but so did another column: small acknowledgments I hadn't noticed before. A junior colleague thanked me for backing her up. A client copied me on a praise-filled email. Someone in finance admitted, "You were right." Each note was proof that my presence mattered, even if the family I married into refused to see it. Late one evening, alone in the office, I opened the file of unsent phrases I'd kept. "That was mine. Please give me credit. Don't talk about me like I'm not here." For the first time, I read them out loud. My voice didn't echo, it filled the room. I closed the file and labeled it with the date, instead of leaving it untitled. That small act felt like breathing in a space I hadn't realized was suffocating me. At home that night, James was already in bed, scrolling on his phone. Vanessa's thinking Aspen for Christmas. He said, Mom wants you to handle the invites. I stood at the doorway, weighing the reflex to say yes. Instead, I said, I can't. I'm focused on your accounts. He frowned, surprised. It's family. I turned off the lamp on my side of the bed. I know. He didn't argue, and I didn't explain. The silence between us wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was honest. Before sleeping, I opened the notebook I now kept by my bed. On the last page I wrote, I am not applying to be here anymore. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a decision yet. It was simply the truth. I didn't know what leaving would look like, but I knew what staying had become. And for the first time in years, I heard my voice at its full volume. It began with a small accident. James had left his tablet on the kitchen counter, unlocked, a rarity in a house where devices were as guarded as secrets. His assistant had called earlier, asking me to send files for an urgent meeting. I told myself I would only forward the documents and nothing more. But the screen lit up with a notification before I could close it. An email. Subject line, Melanie problem. My finger hovered, the way it does when instinct collides with conscience. I tapped. The words were blunt, written in the clipped shorthand James used when speaking to his sister. Dad's right. We need to minimize her involvement. She's getting too much contact. Redirected the latest communications to me. Can you keep her tied up on Davidson? I froze, reading it again. It wasn't just strategy, it was deliberate containment. Vanessa's reply was sharper. Already handled. Told Davidson they need a full rebrand. Should keep your little wife busy while the adults finish Tokyo. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. My name wasn't a name. It was a problem. For months, I had felt the subtle maneuvers, the reassigned projects, the way my achievements disappeared into other hands. Now it was confirmed, stamped in digital ink. This was no misunderstanding, no overreaction. It was intention. I forwarded the chain to myself, deleting the trace from his sent folder. My hands shook, but not from fear, from clarity. The notebook of humiliations had been proof for me. This was proof for the world. That night, I didn't mention it. James came home late, smiling at his phone, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't mine. At dinner, he asked, Did you send the files? I nodded. He didn't notice my silence. When he fell asleep, I unlocked the tablet again. If there was one email, there were more. Passwords gave way to a second account, and with it, a flood. Messages with his father, planning a restructure that would dilute my shares, draft memos about performance issues they were fabricating, and worst of all, notes to his assistant Emily, too intimate to be professional. Lines about weekends, away, about a future that no longer included me. I didn't cry. I read, line after line, each word a nail hammered into the coffin of denial I had lived inside for years. When dawn came, I sat at my desk with a flash drive and saved everything. Folders of emails, attachments, financial drafts. Evidence of a conspiracy I had sensed but never been allowed to name. The next day, I walked through the office like nothing had changed. I answered questions, smiled in meetings, adjusted presentations, but inside, I was no longer asking to be seen. I was seeing them instead. Every smirk, every dismissal, every theft of credit, it all had context now. They hadn't overlooked me. They had worked to erase me. At lunch, Catherine stopped by my desk. You look tired, she said softly. I wanted to tell her everything, but instead I smiled. Just busy with Davidson. She touched my arm, her kindness a reminder that not everyone in the family was blind, but kindness wasn't enough to undo the truth I carried in my bag. That evening, as James scrolled beside me on the couch, I asked, Do you ever think we could run the company differently? He didn't look up. Mel, please. Dad has a plan. You just have to trust us. The word us caught in my chest. There was no us. There was them, and then there was me. I excused myself, saying I had work. Upstairs, I opened my notebook and wrote, It is not in my head. They wrote it down. For years, I had tried to explain the weight of being sidelined. For years, I had swallowed doubt, told myself I was too sensitive, too ambitious, too eager. But now, staring at those emails, I knew I had been right all along. My instincts had not lied. My silence had only delayed the truth. In the weeks that followed, I studied the inbox like a textbook. I learned their patterns, their blind spots, their arrogance. I learned how they thought of me not as a partner, not as family, but as a liability to be managed. And in learning that, I began to see the outlines of another life, one where their laughter no longer defined my worth. I didn't confront James, not yet. To do so would have given him warning, and warning was something he had never given me. Instead, I listened more than I spoke. I smiled when expected. I played the role, but every night, the flash drive grew heavier in my drawer, a quiet weight of justice waiting for the right moment. One Saturday, Diane invited me to help with a charity auction. As we sorted items, she said casually, "It must be hard for you, keeping up." I smiled faintly. "Not as hard as you'd think." She laughed, unaware of the folders I held that could dismantle the entire empire she was protecting. Driving home, I realized something important. Betrayal had been the soil I was planted in, but discovery, that was the light breaking through. That night, in the mirror again, I didn't whisper doubt. I whispered truth. You were right. Not about them, about me. I was right to notice, right to resist, right to keep record. The inbox had confirmed it, and with confirmation came something new, the first outlines of a plan. Once you know the truth, the hardest part isn't deciding what to do, it's pretending you don't know it yet. Every morning after discovering those emails, I woke beside James and acted like nothing had changed. He kissed my cheek, rushed through his routine, and left for work. I smiled when I had to, nodded when expected, and played the role they thought I would never question. Inside, I was counting days. I gave myself 90. Not because I needed that long to leave, but because leaving well would require patience. I wasn't running away. I was dismantling the stage they had built around me, one quiet piece at a time. The first 30 days were about gathering. I collected evidence like someone folding clothes for a trip. Client emails where my work was praised, contracts I had negotiated, presentations I had built. Every time James repeated my idea as his own in a meeting, I noted the date, saved the file, and tucked it away. At night, while he slept, I added to the archive on my flash drive, careful to erase every trace. I also started to separate myself financially. Small transfers, regular enough not to attract notice, moved into accounts at a bank no one in the Bennett circle used. I sold jewelry he had given me, pieces I never liked but wore because they fit the image of his world. I converted the money into cash and stored it in a safe deposit box under my maiden name. Each step was quiet, unremarkable, hidden in the folds of daily life. During the second 30 days, I built an exit no one would see coming. I contacted a divorce attorney known for handling high-profile cases. We met in a discreet office downtown, and when I slid the flash drive across her desk, she raised her eyebrows. "This is unusually thorough," she said. I answered simply, "I've had years to prepare without knowing it." Together, we began assembling a strategy not just to protect what was mine, but to ensure they couldn't erase me the way they had planned. She taught me which documents mattered, how to time my moves, when to stay silent. I followed her instructions like scripture, because every day I spent inside their world was borrowed time. I also started preparing my personal life. I called my brother Alex in Atlanta, someone I hadn't leaned on in years. "I need a place to stay," I told him. There was a pause, then his voice softened. "You don't even have to explain. My guest room is yours." That night, for the first time in years, I felt the safety of knowing someone would open their door to me without conditions. At home, James remained oblivious. He was consumed with the Tokyo expansion, bragging about plans I had put in motion but he now carried as his own. One night he said, "Dad wants me to handle all international accounts. It's my time." He didn't notice the way I kept my eyes on my plate, or the fact that I didn't congratulate him. Silence had become my camouflage. By the third month, the leaving had already begun. I moved small pieces of my life out of the house, one errand at a time. A box of photographs, to storage, a suitcase with clothes left in my car trunk, my grandmother's quilt folded quietly and hidden in the back seat under a blanket. Nothing dramatic, nothing they could trace. If anyone looked too closely, they would see nothing missing because the absence of me had always been invisible to them. The hardest part wasn't the planning. It was maintaining the performance. Family dinners where Diane corrected my accent, not realizing I had already stopped caring. Workdays where James smiled across the table, confident in his position, unaware that I knew every lie he'd written. Nights when I lay beside him while his phone buzzed with messages I no longer needed to read. The temptation to break the silence was strongest then, to shout, to confront, to demand recognition, but confrontation would have given them power. I wasn't leaving for a fight. I was leaving to reclaim what they had convinced themselves I didn't need: my dignity, my presence, my voice. Day 75, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the skyline. I thought about the girl who had walked into this family years ago, full of hope, believing she had found belonging. I thought about the woman who had straightened her hair, softened her voice, learned their games just to be tolerated. And I thought about the person I had become: quiet, deliberate, patient, not invisible, waiting. On day 80, Catherine stopped by my desk again. "You seem lighter," she said gently. I almost laughed at the irony. I had never been heavier with secrets. Yet in truth, I did feel lighter, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to belong. I was simply preparing to leave. I told her, "Maybe I've just stopped carrying what isn't mine." She tilted her head, puzzled, but didn't press further. On day 85, I finalized the last legal documents with my attorney. She asked, "Are you ready for what comes after?" I answered, "I've been ready for years. I just didn't know it." The final week was about release. I scheduled emails to clients, set to send after I was gone, careful, cautious messages that would raise questions without making accusations. I prepared the package for the Securities and Exchange Commission with the evidence of financial irregularities. I wrote a letter for James, not filled with grievances or explanations, but with a single line: "Now you know what happens when I disappear." On day 90, James packed for a weekend trip. I knew it wasn't business. He reminded me to water the plants while he was gone. I smiled, nodded, kissed him goodbye. I watched his car drive away, and then I turned back to the house one last time. The rooms looked exactly as they always had: perfect, curated, sterile, but I saw something different now. I saw a stage where I had played a role written by others, a role I had finally stepped out of. I carried 2 suitcases to my car. One held clothes, the other held the fragments of my life that had always been mine: my grandmother's recipes, old photographs, the quilt I refused to leave behind. I didn't look back as I drove away. Not because I wasn't sentimental, but because the house was never truly mine. The drive to Atlanta was long but strangely calm. The road stretched out before me, and with every mile, I felt the distance widen between the life I was leaving and the one I was choosing. By the time I pulled into Alex's driveway, the sun was setting. He opened the door before I could knock, pulled me into an embrace, and whispered, "Welcome home." For the first time in years, I felt seen. That night, lying in his guest room, I thought about the 90 days that had led me here. 90 days of silence, of preparation, of disappearing in plain sight. They thought invisibility was my weakness, but invisibility had been my cover, and now, it was my freedom. The morning James returned from his trip, I was already gone. My side of the closet looked untouched to anyone glancing quickly, but the truth was, I had taken only what mattered. The house smelled the same: coffee grounds in the trash, fresh flowers in a vase on the table, but there was an emptiness that would take him longer to notice. On his pillow, I left a single page: no list of grievances, no detailed explanations, just a line: "Now you know what happens when I disappear." By the time he opened the door, I was 4 hours away, sitting at my brother's kitchen table in Atlanta, sipping coffee that tasted like safety. Alex had hugged me twice that morning already. "You don't have to explain," he said quietly. "You just have to rest." But rest wasn't possible, not yet. Because disappearing wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the unraveling. 3 days later, the first ripples reached me. Patricia, my attorney, called. "The company is panicking," she said. "Your withdrawal created immediate cash flow problems. They thought your shares were symbolic, but they were wrong." I pictured James pacing in his office, trying to reassure investors, repeating phrases that sounded strong but carried no weight. 2 days after that, the emails I had scheduled went out. Short notes to key clients, written carefully, raising gentle concerns about the company's stability. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't lied. But when people trust your judgment, even subtle hints are enough to plant questions. By the end of the week, 2 major accounts had been paused. I read about it online, in the business section, as though it belonged to someone else's story. Bennett Marketing faces questions amid expansion. No one mentioned my name. They never did, but I could see my fingerprints on the cracks. At night, I lay in the quiet of Alex's guest room, thinking about the bathroom mirror at the Bennett estate. Vanessa's laughter, James's smile. I wondered if they remembered that moment the way I did, or if it had already been swallowed by their need to stay upright while everything tilted. What I didn't expect was the silence from James himself. No calls, no texts, not at first. He must have believed I would return after a dramatic gesture. That was the rhythm we had lived by, his world taking, my world accommodating. But as the days stretched, the silence broke. Messages began arriving. This is childish, Mel, come home. People are asking questions. You're making a mistake. Then, please, we need to talk. I don't understand what you're doing. I didn't respond. Patricia told me to forward them all to her. She said the desperation in his tone would be useful later. I just felt relief each time my phone buzzed, because it meant he was finally noticing what he had ignored for years. The hardest part wasn't ignoring James. It was ignoring the small, familiar ache that came when I remembered the man I once believed he was, the man who chased me at a gala, who said I was different, who claimed to love the parts of me no one else had seen. But that man had laughed at a joke that erased me. And once you've been erased in public, you don't go back to private pretending. The fallout grew louder. Richard suffered a health scare, stress piling onto years of arrogance. Diane clung to her social circles, insisting everything was fine even as invitations dried up. Vanessa posted vague messages online about betrayal and family loyalty. I didn't reply, didn't defend myself, didn't need to. Their own shadows were louder than anything I could say. Through it all, I kept quiet. That was my power. They had built their world on the assumption that my silence was weakness. But silence, when chosen, becomes something else. It becomes space. It becomes control. Weeks later, James showed up in Atlanta. He found me at my office, thinner, tired, his suit wrinkled in a way I had never seen before. "You're really here," he said, as though I might vanish into smoke. "I am," I answered, calm, steady, present. He accused me of destroying everything, of orchestrating chaos, of betrayal. I let him speak. Then I said the only thing that mattered. "I didn't destroy you, James. I just stopped protecting the illusion you built." For the first time, he looked at me as though he actually saw me. But recognition came too late. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window and thought about the irony. For years, they had convinced me I was invisible. And yet, the moment I chose to be gone, their entire world collapsed. Being hard to find wasn't about hiding. It was about finally choosing where I wanted to be seen. 1 year later, the fireworks returned. I stood on the rooftop of my new apartment in Midtown Atlanta, a glass of wine in hand, listening to the laughter of friends drifting from inside. The skyline shimmered in the distance, but I didn't need the view to know how much had changed. I thought about the woman who had sat in a bathroom mirror, wondering if her disappearance would even register. She had been smaller than her own life, folded into corners that didn't belong to her. Tonight, I stood taller, not because anyone gave me permission, but because I had stopped shrinking. Work felt different now. At Horizon, no one tried to erase my name from a contract or my ideas from a meeting. Clients asked for me directly. Colleagues trusted me. When I walked into a room, I didn't wait to be noticed. I spoke, and I was heard. And for the first time in years, the echo that came back was respect. My personal life, too, had grown roots I once believed I wasn't allowed to have. Weekly dinners with Alex. Holidays back in Tennessee with my family. Laughter that didn't cut. A man named David who loved me for my presence, not my performance. His voice was gentle when he told me, "You don't need to prove anything." For once, I believed it. The Bennetts rarely crossed my mind now, though occasionally their names surfaced in the news, attached to lawsuits, sales, or quiet scandals. The empire had cracked where it was weakest. None of it surprised me. They had been too busy pretending to see one another to notice the foundation crumbling beneath their feet. What stayed with me wasn't revenge or satisfaction. It was the realization that visibility doesn't come from others. It begins when you stop hiding from yourself. The mirror that once felt like a stranger now showed someone I recognized, someone I had carried all along. As the first firework burst across the sky, I smiled, not because anyone was watching, but because I finally was. I had disappeared from their world, but I had returned to my own. Asterisk, asterisk, do you think I did the right thing or the wrong thing? Comment your thoughts, and don't forget to like and follow.